The moment I saw the 2 pink lines, my entire world shattered into 1,000 pieces. And the worst part wasn't the pregnancy itself. It was knowing that both Dante and Luca Moretti, the 2 most feared Mafia kings in New York, believed they were the father, and neither would ever let me go. My name is Emma Clark, and 3 months ago I was just an ordinary waitress at an upscale Manhattan restaurant, invisible to the powerful men who dined there, until one reckless night changed everything and pulled me into a world where love, obsession, and danger blurred into one terrifying reality. I never imagined that serving coffee could lead to this, trapped between 2 brothers who controlled the city's underworld, each claiming ownership of my body, my baby, and my future. It started on a rainy October evening when Dante Moretti walked into the restaurant, his presence commanding every eye in the room, his dark suit tailored to perfection, and those piercing gray eyes that seemed to see straight through my soul. He was everything the rumors said: ruthless, calculating, and devastatingly handsome, with a reputation for destroying anyone who crossed him without a second thought. But that night, he looked at me differently, not as a waitress, but as something precious, something he wanted to possess. And when he asked me to join him for a drink after my shift, every rational part of my brain screamed no, while my heart whispered yes. The champagne flowed like water at the exclusive rooftop bar he took me to, and with each glass, my inhibitions melted away until all I could see was him. All I could feel was the magnetic pull between us that defied logic and self-preservation. If you're enjoying this story, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It truly helps me continue bringing you these emotional journeys. What I didn't know was that Luca Moretti, Dante's younger brother, an equally powerful co-leader of the Moretti Empire, had been watching me for weeks, his obsession growing with each passing day, as he planned the perfect moment to make me his. The brothers had an arrangement. They shared everything in their criminal empire, their territory, their enemies, even their women sometimes. But I would become the one thing they refused to share, the spark that would ignite a war between blood. That first night with Dante was intoxicating, filled with whispered promises and a passion that left me breathless and wanting more. But what I didn't realize was that Luca had orchestrated everything, watching from the shadows, waiting for his turn to claim what his brother had touched first. 2 weeks later, I met Luca at a charity gala where I was working a catering shift, and he approached me with the same magnetic confidence as his brother, his emerald green eyes sparkling with mischief and something darker, something possessive that made my pulse race despite knowing I should run. He told me he knew about Dante, that he'd been watching us, and instead of being angry, he wanted his chance, his night with the woman who had captivated his brother's cold heart. I should have recognized the danger, should have understood that I was becoming a pawn in some twisted game between brothers, but there was something about Luca that was different from Dante. Where Dante was ice and control, Luca was fire and chaos, and I was drawn to both like a moth to flames that would inevitably burn me. That night with Luca was wild, reckless, and filled with a passion that matched Dante's, but burned hotter, faster, and when he whispered that I belonged to him now, I believed every word even as my conscience screamed about the betrayal I was committing. The pregnancy test trembled in my hands 3 weeks later as I sat on the cold bathroom floor of my tiny studio apartment, tears streaming down my face while my mind raced through the impossible mathematics of my situation. I had been with both brothers within days of each other, and now, according to the ultrasound appointment I'd had yesterday, I was carrying twins, 2 babies who might have 2 different fathers, both of whom were dangerous, powerful men who would kill to claim what was theirs. My best friend Sophia had warned me to stay away from the Moretti brothers, had told me stories about women who disappeared or ended up owned by them, trapped in golden cages with no escape. But I hadn't listened, and now I was paying the price for my recklessness with interest compounded by 2 heartbeats that weren't my own. The knock on my door made me jump so violently I nearly dropped the test, and my heart nearly stopped when I heard Dante's voice, smooth and commanding, demanding I let him in because he knew I was hiding something and he always got what he wanted. I scrambled to hide the pregnancy test, wiping my tears and trying to compose myself. But the moment I opened the door and saw his face, I knew he could read me like an open book, could see the fear and secret I was desperately trying to conceal behind shaking hands and forced smiles. "Emma," he said, his voice dropping to that dangerous tone that made my knees weak and my resolve crumble. You're going to tell me right now what's wrong. And you're not going to lie to me because I always know when you're lying. And you won't like what happens when I have to extract the truth myself." I tried to deflect, tried to say everything was fine, and that he should leave. But Dante pushed past me into the apartment, his eyes scanning the small space with the precision of a predator hunting prey until they landed on the bathroom. And before I could stop him, he found the Tess sitting on the sink. The silence that followed was deafening, stretching out like a chasm between us, while I watched Dante's face transform from confusion to shock, to something fierce and possessive that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. "You're pregnant," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact he was already accepting and reshaping his world around. And then his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that stole my breath and pinned me in place. With my child. I wanted to tell him the truth right then. Wanted to explain about Luca, about the twins, about the impossibility of knowing which baby belonged to which brother. But the words stuck in my throat because I knew what this revelation would do to him, to them, to me, and to the fragile life growing inside me that deserved better than the chaos I'd created. Dante crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands cupping my face with surprising gentleness that contrasted sharply with the barely controlled violence I could see simmering in his eyes. And he whispered, "You're mine now, Emma. Completely mine. And I'm going to protect you and our baby from everything and everyone, even if that means locking you away where no one can ever touch you or take you from me." His kiss was possessive, claiming, and filled with a promise that felt more like a threat. And I melted into it even as fear coiled in my stomach, because I knew this moment of peace was temporary, knew that the truth would explode like a grenade and destroy whatever fragile understanding we'd just reached. But fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor, because 30 minutes later, while Dante was on the phone in my kitchen arranging to move me into his penthouse and discussing security details, Luca appeared at my door, his face dark with anger, and something that looked like betrayal and hurt mixed together. "I have men watching you, Emma," Luca said coldly, pushing past me without waiting for an invitation, his body radiating tension and barely controlled rage. "And they told me my dear brother just made a very interesting visit to your apartment, looking quite pleased with himself." The moment Luca and Dante's eyes met across my small living room, the temperature dropped 20 degrees, and I realized with growing horror that I was standing in the middle of a powder keg that was about to explode and take me with it. "She's pregnant with my child," Dante growled, positioning himself between Luca and me, his body language screaming territorial dominance and barely restrained violence that promised bloodshed if his brother took one more step. Luca's laugh was bitter and sharp, cutting through the tension like a knife slicing through silk. "Your child? Brother, let me remind you that I was with Emma 2 weeks ago, which means that baby could just as easily be mine, and we both know you can't prove otherwise until it's born." The revelation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to detonate, and I watched both brothers process what this meant, that I had been with both of them, that the baby's paternity was uncertain, and that neither would ever willingly walk away from what they considered theirs by right of conquest and possession. Dante's face turned to stone, his gray eyes going completely cold as he slowly turned to look at me, and I saw betrayal flash across his features before the ruthless Mafia king mask slammed back into place, hiding whatever human emotion had briefly surfaced. "Twins," I whispered, my voice barely audible but cutting through their standoff like a gunshot. And both brothers froze mid-breath, their attention snapping back to me with laser focus that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. "I'm carrying twins, and I have no idea which of you fathered which baby, or if one of you fathered both. And I'm terrified because I never wanted to hurt either of you, but I've made a mess of everything." The implications were staggering. 2 babies, 2 potential fathers, and an impossible situation that would either tear apart the most powerful mafia family in New York or forge an alliance more dangerous than anything the criminal underworld had ever seen. Luca was the first to move, crossing to me with determined strides and pulling me against his chest despite Dante's warning growl, his hand splaying possessively over my still flat stomach, like he was already claiming the children inside as his own. "Then we'll do the DNA test when they're born," Luca declared, his voice rough with emotion and determination. "But until then, Emma belongs to both of us, and anyone who tries to take her or hurt her will answer to the full force of the Moretti Empire, united for the first time in years." I expected Dante to explode, to rage against sharing me with his brother, to perhaps even hurt one or both of us in his fury. But instead, he approached slowly, his eyes never leaving mine as he placed his hand next to Luca's on my stomach, creating an image that should have been wrong, but somehow felt more right than anything in my chaotic life. "We protect what's ours," Dante said quietly, but with absolute conviction that left no room for argument or negotiation, and in that moment, I realized my life would never be simple again. I was bound to both Moretti brothers, carrying their children, and stepping into a world where love and danger were two sides of the same coin that could land on either face without warning. Within 24 hours of that revelation, I found myself standing in the massive foyer of the Moretti mansion, a sprawling estate in the Hamptons that screamed wealth, power, and danger in every marble column, crystal chandelier, and priceless piece of art that decorated walls meant to intimidate and impress in equal measure. My tiny studio apartment was already a distant memory, packed up and moved by Dante's men, while I sat in shocked silence, trying to process how quickly my entire life had been dismantled and reconstructed, according to the brothers' will, without my consent or input, beyond my initial agreement to this insane arrangement. Sophia had called me crying earlier that morning, begging me not to go with them, warning me that women who entered the Moretti world rarely came out unchanged, and that she'd read about girls who disappeared into Mafia families never to be heard from again. But I didn't have a choice anymore, not with 2 babies growing inside me at an alarming rate, not with 2 powerful men who had declared me theirs in front of witnesses, and certainly not with the enemies the brothers had made over the years who would see me and my children as perfect targets for revenge, leverage, or simply collateral damage in wars I didn't understand. The mansion was more fortress than home, with security cameras covering every angle, armed guards patrolling the manicured grounds 24 hours a day, and enough weapons hidden throughout the house to supply a small army or fight off a siege that apparently wasn't entirely out of the question. Dante had given me the master suite on the 3rd floor, a space larger than my entire former apartment had been, complete with a walk-in closet already filled with designer clothes in my exact size, and a bathroom that looked like it belonged in a luxury spa with marble everything and a bathtub big enough to swim in. "You'll be safe here," Dante had assured me, his hand resting on the small of my back in that possessive way he had, guiding me through room after room like I was a princess being shown her new castle. "No one gets past our security without us knowing about it, and both Luca and I have rooms on this floor, so we're always close enough to protect you from any threat." The implication wasn't lost on me. They would be watching, guarding, and probably controlling every aspect of my life from this moment forward, and the golden cage I'd entered was beautiful, but still very much a cage with bars made of protection and possession. Luca had different ideas about the arrangement, storming into my new room that first night, with a bottle of expensive wine that he drank, while I sipped water, and a declaration that sent shivers down my spine, and heat pooling in places that shouldn't respond to a man who'd helped trap me here. "I don't care what Dante says about taking this slow and letting you adjust to your new life," Luca announced, his green eyes blazing with possessive heat and barely controlled desire. "You're carrying my child, Emma, and I'm not going to pretend this is some polite arrangement where we all keep our distance and act like civilized people when all I want is to claim you completely." He crossed the room to where I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the grounds, backing me against the glass with his body until I could feel his heat and smell his cologne, his hand sliding into my hair with familiar intimacy that made my body remember our night together. "I want you in my bed, in my life, completely and utterly mine, and I'm done sharing you with anyone, even my brother who thinks he can control everything." The kiss that followed was demanding, desperate, and filled with all the chaos and passion that defined Luca Moretti, and I melted into it despite my better judgment, my hands fisting in his shirt as my body betrayed every logical thought my brain tried to produce. His hands roamed my body with possessive familiarity, relearning curves that were already changing with pregnancy, and I was lost in the sensation until Dante's voice cut through the haze like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head. "Get your hands off her." Dante's voice was deadly quiet, but the rage underneath was palpable and terrifying, and Luca pulled away from me slowly, deliberately, with a challenging smirk that made the situation infinitely worse and practically guaranteed violence. "She came to me willingly, brother," Luca taunted, his voice dripping with satisfaction and challenge. "Maybe Emma prefers fire to ice, passion to your cold control and calculated moves. I watched in horror as Dante's fist connected with Luca's jaw with a sickening crack, sending his brother stumbling back into my dresser and knocking over expensive perfume bottles that shattered on the floor. And then, they were on each other like animals. Years of brotherly rivalry and competition exploding into violence that shook the room and terrified me more than anything in my life. They crashed into furniture, broke a lamp, and blood splattered on my new carpet as they fought with the kind of brutal efficiency that reminded me these weren't just wealthy men playing at danger, but actual killers who'd built an empire on violence. "Stop," I screamed, my hands protectively covering my stomach, as maternal instinct overrode fear. Tears streaming down my face as terror for my babies overwhelmed everything else. "Please, stop. You're scaring me and you're going to hurt the babies." The sound of my crying cut through their rage faster than any weapon could have, and both brothers froze mid-punch, their attention immediately shifting from each other to me, with identical expressions of horror and regret. Dante reached me first, his bloodied hands suddenly gentle as he pulled me into his arms, whispering apologies against my hair, while Luca hovered nearby, his own face showing regret and concern that actually looked genuine beneath the blood streaming from his split lip. "We're sorry, Cara," Dante murmured, using the Italian endearment for the first time, his voice rough with emotion. "We shouldn't have lost control like that, not in front of you, not when you need us to be strong and stable and everything you can depend on." Luca moved closer despite Dante's warning glare, his hand tentatively touching my shoulder, and for a moment, the three of us stood there in a strange embrace that felt both wrong and exactly right, a triangle of need, possession, and something that might have been the beginning of love, or the seeds of our mutual destruction. "This can't happen again," I said firmly, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. "I won't raise my children in a home where their fathers are trying to kill each other, so either you two figure out how to share, or I'll find a way to leave, and you'll never see these babies or me again." The threat was probably empty given their resources and my lack of options, but something in my voice must have convinced them I meant it, because both brothers nodded solemnly and helped me to the bed, fussing over me until I wanted to scream, but also feeling touched by their sudden cooperation. That night, we made an agreement. They would both court me, both prove themselves worthy of being fathers to my children, and I would have time to figure out my feelings without pressure or violence clouding my judgment. It was an impossible situation, but as I lay in my enormous bed hours later, thinking about the two powerful men sleeping in rooms on either side of mine like guards or prisoners I couldn't quite decide which, I realized that maybe impossible was the only thing that made sense in this twisted new reality I'd stumbled into. My first week at the Moretti mansion passed in a blur of luxury I'd never imagined. Constant attention from both brothers that ranged from smothering to sweet, and an undercurrent of danger that never quite disappeared, no matter how beautiful my surroundings, or how gentle their touches. Dante had hired a private obstetrician who made house calls twice a week, ensuring I received the best prenatal care money could buy without having to risk leaving the estate and exposing myself to potential enemies. And every appointment became a strange family affair with both brothers present, asking detailed questions, arguing over baby names, and generally making Dr. Martinez's job more complicated than it needed to be. The doctor found the situation unusual but kept her professional mask firmly in place, though I caught her giving me sympathetic looks when the brothers' competitive nature turned every discussion about cribs or nursery colors into a debate that required mediation. "Both babies are developing perfectly," Dr. Martinez assured me during the week 2 visit, her hand moving the ultrasound wand across my growing belly, while both brothers leaned in to watch the screen with identical expressions of wonder. Though I have to say, this is the first time in my 20-year career I've had 2 potential fathers attending every single appointment and taking notes like medical students. The babies were already making their presence known with increasing frequency, little flutters that would soon become kicks, and watching Dante and Luca's faces as they saw the tiny heartbeats on screen made my own heart ache with complicated emotions I couldn't quite name. The reality of their world hit me hard one morning when I came downstairs to find Dante and Luca in the study, surrounded by their top lieutenants, discussing a threat from a rival family called the Salvatores, who apparently had issues with the brothers' recent territorial expansion. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation, but the door was cracked open, and I froze in the hallway as Dante's cold voice outlined a plan to eliminate the problem with surgical precision and maximum intimidation that would send a message to anyone else considering challenging Moretti authority. "They've been asking questions about Emma," Luca added, his tone darker than I'd ever heard it, carrying an edge of violence that made my blood run cold. "About who she is to us, whether she's a weakness they can exploit, if the babies are real or just rumors." The casual way they discussed violence and death, talking about eliminating people like they were discussing removing weeds from a garden, made my stomach turn and reminded me that these men I was falling for were not just wealthy businessmen with questionable connections, but actual criminals who built their empire on blood, fear, and ruthless efficiency. I must have made a sound, some small gasp of horror or fear, because suddenly all eyes in the room turned to me, and I watched the transformation as Dante and Luca immediately dismissed their men with curt orders and pulled me into the study, closing the door with ominous finality that made the large room feel suddenly small and suffocating. "How much did you hear?" Dante asked, and I could see him calculating how to handle this situation, whether to lie and protect my innocence, or trust me with the truth of what my life would really be like as part of their world. "Enough to know that people want to hurt me because of you," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, drawing on reserves of courage I didn't know I possessed. "Enough to know that my babies are targets before they're even born, before they've done anything except exist." Luca entered my personal space then, reading the tension immediately, and together the brothers formed a united front that was both comforting and terrifying in its intensity and the casual way they positioned themselves like bodyguards preparing for battle. "No one will touch you," Dante declared, his hand cupping my face with surprising tenderness that contrasted sharply with the violence he'd just been planning. "We'll burn New York to the ground before we let anyone hurt you or our children, and the Salvatoris will learn what happens when someone threatens what belongs to the Moretti family." The possessiveness should have annoyed me, should have made me rail against being considered property, but instead, I felt a rush of safety and something darker, something that enjoyed being claimed and protected by men powerful enough to back up their promises with action. Luca's arms wrapped around me from behind, his hands splaying over my stomach where the babies grew, and he whispered against my ear, "You're ours to protect, Emma, and we're very good at protecting what's ours, so try not to worry about things that will never happen, because we won't allow them to happen." The threat became horrifyingly real 3 days later when a package arrived at the mansion, delivered by an unknown courier who disappeared before security could detain and question him about who sent him and where he came from. Inside the innocuous brown box was a stuffed teddy bear, cute and harmless at first glance, until Dante examined it more closely with the paranoia of someone who'd survived multiple assassination attempts and found the message sewn into its belly with red thread that looked disturbingly like dried blood. The note read, "The babies die before they're born, and the girl becomes ours to do with as we please. Consider this your only warning, Moretti brothers." I watched the color drain from both brothers' faces, watched Dante's hands shake with barely controlled rage, while Luca punched the wall hard enough to leave a dent in the plaster and bloody his knuckles, and fear unlike anything I'd ever experienced gripped my heart in an icy fist. "Get her upstairs now," Dante ordered the guards who'd appeared at the first sign of trouble, his voice carrying absolute authority that no one would dare question. "And no one comes in or out of this house until I find out who sent this and make them regret ever being born. Make them wish I'd killed them quickly instead of taking my time." The guards practically carried me up the stairs despite my protests, locking me in my suite with armed men stationed outside my door. And I was left alone with my fear and my racing thoughts about what the brothers were doing, and whether the babies I carried would ever be safe in this world of violence and retribution. The next 24 hours were the longest of my life as the brothers disappeared into their world of violence and retribution, leaving me under heavy guard with no information about what was happening beyond these walls. I tried calling Sophia, desperately needing to hear a familiar voice that wasn't connected to organized crime, but the guards had confiscated my phone, citing security concerns, and I was truly alone for the first time since moving into the mansion, left with nothing but my thoughts and my fears. When Dante and Luca finally returned, both were covered in blood that they assured me wasn't their own, carrying themselves with the satisfied air of predators who had successfully hunted and brought down their prey in the most brutal way possible. "It's handled," Luca said simply, pulling me into his arms despite the blood staining his expensive clothes and the smell of gunpowder that clung to him. The Salvatores won't be bothering us anymore, or anyone else for that matter. I didn't ask what handled meant, didn't want to know the specific details of what they'd done to eliminate the threat, but the way both brothers held me that night, with desperate possession and something softer that might have been fear of losing me, told me they'd crossed lines even they rarely approached to keep me and the babies safe. Dante's hands shook slightly as he cupped my face, and I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before, something vulnerable and almost broken. When I thought about someone hurting you, hurting them, he gestured to my stomach. I realized I would destroy the entire world if that's what it took to keep you safe, and that terrifies me because I've never cared about anything or anyone enough to risk everything. As my pregnancy progressed and my belly started to show the unmistakable curve of life growing inside me, the brothers' attention became even more intense, each trying to prove themselves the better choice, the worthier father, the man I should ultimately choose when the time came to make impossible decisions. Dante's approach was classic old-world romance, straight out of movies I'd watched as a lonely teenager, dreaming of being swept off my feet. Expensive jewelry that cost more than I'd made in years of waitressing, surprise concerts from my favorite artists performed privately in the mansion's ballroom for an audience of just us, and quiet evenings where he'd read to me and my growing babies in Italian, his voice like velvet wrapping around me and making me feel cherished in ways I'd never experienced. He showed me the man behind the Mafia king mask, shared stories of his childhood with Luca, before their father's murder, forced them into this life of violence and power, and confessed fears about being a good father that made him achingly human instead of the cold criminal I'd first met. "I look at you carrying my child," Dante whispered one night as we sat in the library. His hand splayed across my rounded stomach, feeling the baby's move. "And I realize you've become more important to me than the entire empire I've built over 15 years, more valuable than all the money and power and respect. And that terrifies me because caring about something gives your enemies a weapon to use against you." Luca's strategy was completely different, all spontaneity and passion, pulling me into his chaotic world with the force of a hurricane that swept away careful plans and logical thinking. He'd wake me at midnight to drive to the city for the best pizza from a tiny shop in Brooklyn that only he knew about, would dance with me in the massive kitchen at 2 a.m. to songs playing from his phone, and made me laugh until my sides hurt with his stories and ridiculous impressions of the other mafia bosses they had to deal with. But he also showed me vulnerability in unexpected moments that caught me off guard, like when he admitted he was terrified of being like their father, a man who valued power over family and died alone with more enemies than friends, and how the thought of my babies calling someone else Papa literally kept him awake at night staring at the ceiling. "I know Dante can give you stability and security and all the practical things you need," Luca said during one of our late-night conversations on the mansion's roof where we could see the stars. "But I can give you passion and adventure and a life where every day is exciting, and our children will grow up knowing what it means to really feel alive instead of just existing safely." The impossible choice was tearing me apart, because the truth was, I had fallen completely in love with both of them, with Dante's quiet strength and protective nature that made me feel safe for the first time in my life, and with Luca's wild heart and infectious joy that made me feel alive in ways I hadn't known were possible. My 20th week ultrasound revealed I was carrying one boy and one girl, and I watched both brothers' faces light up with pure wonder as they saw their children on the screen in more detail than ever before, still not knowing which baby belonged to which father. "A son and a daughter," Dante breathed, his voice thick with emotion that he usually kept locked away, and beside him, Luca was openly crying, all his usual bravado stripped away to reveal the man underneath who wanted desperately to be a good father. In that moment, watching them fall in love with my babies, touching the screen like they could reach through and hold their children, I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. I didn't want to choose between them, didn't want to break this strange triangle we'd formed. Didn't want my children growing up with only one father when they could have 2 men who would move heaven and earth to protect them and love them. That night, I gathered every ounce of courage I possessed and asked them both to meet me in the mansion's library, a neutral space where we could talk without the weight of bedrooms and sexual implications clouding the conversation. "I can't choose," I told them honestly, my hands protectively cradling my belly where their children rested. "And I know that sounds crazy and selfish and probably impossible, But the truth is, I've fallen in love with both of you, with different parts of you that somehow complement each other, and the thought of losing either one breaks my heart into pieces. I expected anger, expected one or both to walk away, expected demands and ultimatums, but instead, they exchanged a long look that seemed to communicate years of brotherhood and understanding that went beyond words. We'd be lying if we said we didn't see this coming, Dante admitted, moving closer with careful steps like he was approaching something precious and fragile. And we've been discussing among ourselves various options for how this could work. Luca completed the thought, his hand finding mine and squeezing gently. We share everything else in our empire: Emma, territory, money, power, responsibilities. So why not share the greatest treasure we've ever found? The proposition was radical, probably illegal in most conventional places, and definitely unconventional by any society's standards. But as they explained their plan, both brothers as fathers to both children regardless of biology, all of us living together as one unusual family, sharing resources and responsibilities, and yes, even sharing me in ways that made my face flush with heat. I felt something click into place like a puzzle piece finding its home. It won't be easy, Dante warned, always the pragmatist who saw potential problems. People will talk and judge, enemies will try to use our arrangement against us, and we'll have to navigate jealousy and complications every single day for the rest of our lives. But when has anything worth having ever been easy? Luca countered, his eternal optimism shining through the concerns. And our children will be loved by 3 parents instead of 2, protected by twice the power and resources, and grow up in a home filled with more love than most people see in their entire lifetimes. As I looked at both of them, my ice and my fire, my stability and my chaos, my twin protectors who wanted to build something impossible together, I nodded, accepting this unconventional future that somehow felt more right than any traditional path could have been. Planning a wedding where the bride would marry 2 grooms simultaneously required creativity, absolute discretion, and the kind of power and connections that only the Moretti brothers possessed after years of building their empire. The ceremony took place in the mansion's gardens under a full moon, beneath a canopy of white roses and thousands of twinkling lights that transformed the space into something magical, with only the most trusted members of their organization present as witnesses who would take our secret to their graves. I wore a custom Vera Wang gown that accommodated my 6-month baby bump beautifully, feeling like a queen from some fairy tale as I walked down the aisle toward Dante and Luca, both devastatingly handsome in matching black tuxedos, their faces showing identical expressions of love and possessive pride that made my heart race. The officiant was a carefully selected judge who owed the Morettis enough favors to perform this highly irregular ceremony without asking uncomfortable questions. And though the legal paperwork would only show me married to Dante for technical and legal reasons that their lawyers had explained at length, the spiritual and emotional commitment was to both brothers equally. Emma Clark, Dante began when it was time for vows, his voice strong and sure, carrying across the gathered crowd. I promise to protect you and our children with my last breath, to provide for you always with everything you could ever need or want, to respect your strength and independence even when it frustrates me, and to love you through every storm we'll face together. His gray eyes held mine with such intensity I felt it in my soul, and I knew he meant every word with the same absolute conviction he brought to everything he did. Luca went next, his vows characteristically more passionate and emotional, his voice rough with feelings he didn't bother hiding. Emma, you've made me believe in love when I thought I was too broken and damaged for it, and I promise to make you laugh every single day, to keep life exciting and adventurous, to never let our spark fade into comfortable routine, and to be the father our children deserve instead of the one I had. When it was my turn, I looked between them, my heart so full it felt like it might burst from my chest. I promise to love you both, not in spite of your darkness, but because of everything you are, your strength, your passion, your complicated history, and your fierce dedication to family. And I promise to build this unusual life with courage and complete honesty, to be the partner and mother our family needs. The kisses that sealed our vows, first Dante with controlled passion, then Luca with wild enthusiasm, were tender and filled with promise for the future we were building together. And I felt my babies kick enthusiastically, as if they were celebrating too, and approving of this unconventional arrangement they'd been born into. The reception was a lavish affair that attracted attention from every major Mafia family in New York and beyond. all of them curious about the brothers who were powerful enough to share a wife without it showing weakness or vulnerability that enemies could exploit. I watched Dante and Luca work the room together with practiced ease, presenting a united front, subtly warning anyone who might think our arrangement was something to exploit or attack, and I felt pride swell in my chest at their coordination and the respect they commanded despite breaking every conventional rule. Sophia attended despite her reservations, though she spent most of the evening looking worried and pulling me aside repeatedly to ask if I was really okay with this, if they were forcing me into something I didn't want, if I needed help escaping before it was too late. "I'm choosing this," I assured her, squeezing her hands and trying to make her understand. "I know it looks crazy from the outside, impossible even, but this is what I want, what we all want, and I've never been more sure of anything in my entire life." She didn't look convinced, but she hugged me tight and promised to always be there if I needed her, which meant more than she probably realized. The honeymoon was postponed due to security concerns that hadn't fully resolved and my advancing pregnancy that made travel risky, but the brothers transformed the entire east wing of the mansion into a private paradise for the three of us, complete with a home theater, spa facilities, and every luxury imaginable. Our sleeping arrangements evolved naturally over the following weeks. Some nights I'd fall asleep with Dante after hours of deep conversation about the future, his plans for the children's education, and how to keep them safe in this dangerous world. Other nights Luca would steal me away for late-night movies and junk food that my doctor probably wouldn't approve of, and wild passion that left me breathless. And sometimes we'd all three fall asleep together in the massive custom bed we'd had built. In my suite, their hands both resting on my belly, feeling their babies move and kick. It was unconventional and complicated, and required constant communication to navigate jealousies and scheduling, but it worked for us. This strange triangle that had somehow balanced into something beautiful and functional. But not everyone was happy about our arrangement, particularly Dante and Luca's uncle Marco Moretti, who had been angling for more power in the organization for years and saw our unusual marriage as a sign of weakness he could exploit. He started spreading rumors through the underworld with calculated precision, suggesting that the brothers were so distracted by their little pet that they were neglecting business, that territories were being lost to rivals, that allies were questioning the Moretti strength and leadership. The whispers grew louder and more insistent, until Dante and Luca were forced to call a meeting of all the family captains, a gathering where they would either solidify their power once and for all, or face a coup that could tear apart everything they'd built over 15 years. I wasn't supposed to attend the family meeting where the brothers' leadership would be challenged, but my stubborn nature, which both Dante and Luca claimed to love and hate in equal measure depending on the day, insisted that I be present since the accusations centered around me and my supposed corrupting influence. 7 months pregnant with twins that seemed to grow larger every day, I waddled into the mansion's conference room, wearing a designer maternity dress that cost more than my old apartment's yearly rent, and enough determination to make even the hardest criminals step aside and let me pass. Marco's face when he saw me was priceless. Shock that I'd dared attend, anger that his plans were being disrupted, and a flicker of fear that told me he knew his carefully constructed challenge was about to crumble because he'd underestimated both me and the brothers' united resolve. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice carrying despite my nervousness and the babies doing gymnastics in my belly. "I understand there are concerns about my presence in the Moretti family, about whether I'm a distraction or a weakness that compromises your leadership." The room full of dangerous men went silent, all eyes on me, and I felt Dante and Luca's presence behind me like twin pillars of support giving me strength. Let me be perfectly clear about something. I didn't ask to be brought into this world, didn't seek out your bosses, but I'm here now, and I'm carrying the next generation of Morettis. And if any of you think that makes Dante and Luca weak, then you're too stupid to deserve your positions. The shocked gasps told me I'd crossed several lines of protocol, but I pressed forward, channeling every ounce of confidence I could muster. "Since I've been here, have the brothers lost any territory?" I asked, knowing full well they'd actually expanded significantly. "Have any of your enemies successfully challenged the Moretti power?" The silence was my answer. No, because while Dante and Luca have been building a family with me, they've also been more motivated than ever to secure and expand their empire, to build something strong enough to protect not just themselves, but the children who will inherit everything they've created. Marco tried to interrupt, to say something about tradition and proper respect, but Luca cut him off with a look that promised violence if he didn't shut up immediately. "My uncle has been skimming money from our operations," Dante announced coldly, dropping the bombshell with perfect timing. "We've had accountants going through the books for the past month, and Marco has stolen approximately $2 million that he's hidden in offshore accounts, thinking we wouldn't notice because we were distracted by Emma and the babies." The room erupted in chaos, captains shouting questions and accusations, and I watched Marco's face turn white as his betrayal was exposed in front of everyone. "This meeting was never about questioning whether Emma makes us weak," Luca continued, his voice cutting through the noise. "It was about catching a traitor who thought he could use our happiness against us, and instead he's revealed himself for the snake he always was." Marco tried to run, actually made it to the door before Dante's men grabbed him, and the fear in his eyes as he realized his fate was sealed made me feel simultaneously powerful and sick to my stomach. "You would choose her over family?" Marco spat, gesturing at me with contempt. "Some waitress who spread her legs for both of you?" The words hadn't fully left his mouth before Dante's fist connected with his face, breaking his nose with a sickening crunch. "She is family," Dante growled. "She's carrying my children. She's my wife, and she's worth 1,000 of you, uncle." Luca joined in then, and I had to look away as they administered brutal justice that everyone in the room accepted as necessary and appropriate for the level of betrayal Marco had committed. "Take him to the warehouse," Dante ordered Dee when they were finished making their point, his voice cold and emotionless despite the blood on his hands. "And make sure everyone in New York knows what happens to those who betray the Moretti family and insult what we hold sacred." The captains nodded in approval, several coming forward to pledge their continued loyalty and congratulate us on the upcoming babies, and I realized that somehow my presence and my willingness to stand up for our family had actually strengthened the brothers' position rather than weakened it like Marco had hoped. That night, after the meeting concluded and the immediate danger passed, both brothers were unusually quiet as they helped me upstairs, their minds clearly processing what had happened and how close we'd come to internal war. "You shouldn't have come," Dante said finally, though his tone was more admiration than anger. "It was dangerous, and you could have been hurt if things had gone differently." I turned to face them both, my hands on my enormous belly, and said firmly, "I'm not some delicate flower who needs to be locked away. I'm carrying your children, and I'm part of this family, which means I stand with you when you're challenged, not hide in my room hoping everything works out." Luca laughed then, breaking the tension, and pulled me into his arms carefully. "God, I love you. You stubborn, beautiful, crazy woman who walks into rooms full of killers and lectures them like misbehaving children." The babies kicked hard then, as if agreeing with their father, and we all laughed at the perfect timing. Dante's hand joined Luca's on my belly, feeling the movements, and he whispered, "They're going to be just like you, strong and fearless and completely unstoppable." That night, we all slept together in the massive bed, their bodies protective on either side of me, and I felt safer than I ever had despite knowing the violence they'd committed to keep our family intact. The next morning brought news that Marco had been found dead in the warehouse, his betrayal and punishment serving as a message that the Moretti power was absolute and united, and anyone who thought otherwise would meet the same fate without mercy or hesitation. At 38 weeks pregnant, I was enormous, uncomfortable, and desperate for the babies to arrive so I could finally see my feet again and sleep in a position other than propped up by 17 pillows. Dr. Martinez had been coming daily, monitoring everything obsessively because twin pregnancies were high risk and because Dante and Luca paid her enough to basically live at the mansion for the final weeks. "Any day now," she kept saying with cheerful optimism that made me want to throw things at her. "Those babies are in perfect position and just waiting for the right moment to make their entrance into the world." The brothers had transformed an entire wing of the mansion into a state-of-the-art medical facility, complete with equipment that most hospitals would envy, because they refused to risk taking me to a public hospital where security couldn't be absolutely guaranteed. The labor started at 3 a.m. with contractions that felt like my body was being torn apart from the inside, and my screaming brought both brothers running from their respective rooms where they'd been taking turns staying close. "It's time," I gasped between contractions, gripping Luca's hand hard enough to bruise while Dante called Dr. Martinez and the medical team they'd assembled. The next 12 hours were a blur of pain, fear, encouragement from the brothers who never left my side, and the constant monitoring of 2 babies who seemed determined to make their arrival as dramatic as possible. "You're doing amazing, Kara," Dante kept saying, wiping my forehead with cool cloths and looking genuinely terrified beneath his calm mask. "Just a little longer, and we'll meet our children." "I can't," I sobbed at hour 10, exhausted beyond anything I'd ever experienced. "I can't do this anymore. It hurts too much." Luca climbed onto the bed beside me despite Dr. Martinez's protests about sterile fields, holding me against his chest and whispering fiercely, "Yes, you can, Emma. You're the strongest person I've ever met. You faced down a room of killers at 7 months pregnant. You can absolutely bring our babies into this world." His faith in me, their combined support and love surrounding me like armor, gave me the strength to push through the final brutal hours until finally, at 3:47 p.m., our son entered the world screaming his fury at the indignity of birth. "He's perfect," Dante breathed, tears streaming down his face as Dr. Martinez placed the tiny, wriggling baby on my chest. Absolutely perfect. We had exactly 4 minutes to marvel at our son before the contraction started again, signaling that his sister was ready to make her own dramatic entrance. The second birth was faster, but somehow more intense, and at 4:23 p.m. our daughter arrived, smaller than her brother but with lungs just as powerful and a full head of dark hair. "A boy and a girl," Luca sobbed openly, not bothering to hide his emotions. "We have a son and a daughter, Emma. We have a family." The hours after the birth were surreal, floating in exhaustion and joy as we held our babies, marveling at tiny fingers and toes, arguing playfully about who they looked like more. Our son had Dante's gray eyes and serious expression even as a newborn, while our daughter had Luca's green eyes and what already looked like a mischievous personality. "We need names," I said, looking between the brothers who'd been fighting about this for months without reaching agreement. "Dante chose our son's name," Luca conceded graciously, "because he won the coin toss, though I still think it's rigged." Dante smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. "Marco, but we'll call him Mark. A strong name for a strong boy who'll lead the family someday." I tensed at the name, thinking of Uncle Marco, but Dante shook his head. "The name isn't tainted, and our son will redeem it, show what a true Moretti man should be." "And our daughter?" I prompted, looking at Luca expectantly. "Isabella," he said softly, stroking her tiny hand with one finger. "After our mother, the only person who ever showed us real love before you came into our lives." The name fit perfectly, and as I held Isabella while Dante cradled Mark, Luca sitting beside us with his arms around all of us, I felt complete in a way I'd never imagined possible. The DNA tests were done that day, simple cheek swabs that would tell us which baby belonged to which brother biologically. But as we waited for results, something interesting happened. We realized we didn't care anymore. These were our children, all of ours, regardless of whose DNA they carried, and nothing would change how much we loved them or our commitment to raising them together. When the results came back 3 days later, revealing that Mark was Dante's biological son and Isabella was Luca's, there was a moment of quiet acknowledgement, but no change in how we treated the babies or each other. "She has your eyes," Dante said to Luca, holding Isabella with the same tenderness he showed Mark, "but she'll call me Papa just like he will." Luca nodded, cradling Mark, who'd fussed until his non-biological father picked him up. "And he has your serious nature already, but he's mine too, brother, just like she's yours." It was perfect symmetry, each brother having one biological child, but both claiming both babies equally, and I watched them navigate fatherhood together with surprising cooperation, and only minimal arguing about whose method was better for diaper changes or getting the babies to sleep. 6 months after the twins' birth, our unusual family had settled into a rhythm that worked, despite defying every conventional norm and probably breaking several laws that we chose to ignore. I discovered that motherhood with 2 devoted partners was exponentially easier than doing it alone. When Mark needed feeding at 2 a.m., Dante would handle it while Luca took care of Isabella's 3 a.m. wake-up, and I actually got sleep in between, a luxury most new mothers never experienced. The babies were thriving, growing faster than seemed possible, and already showing distinct personalities that kept us constantly entertained and occasionally terrified. Mark was serious and observant like Dante, watching everything with those gray eyes that seemed to catalog information even at 6 months old, while Isabella was all chaos and laughter like Luca, babbling constantly and demanding attention from everyone in her vicinity. The underworld had accepted our arrangement with surprising grace, mostly because the Moretti power had only grown stronger with our united family front, and nobody was stupid enough to challenge us after what happened to Marco. Other families sent gifts for the babies, expensive offerings that were really peace offerings and acknowledgments of the next generation's power. We had started taking the twins to carefully controlled family meetings, letting the organization see the heirs they would eventually serve, and watching dangerous criminals turn into cooing idiots around Isabella and Mark was endlessly amusing. She smiled at me. One particularly brutal enforcer announced proudly after Isabella grabbed his finger, "The princess smiled right at me, boss." Luca and Dante exchanged amused looks, and I realized these babies would grow up loved and protected by an entire army of criminals who'd die before letting harm come to them. Sophia finally accepted our relationship after spending a weekend at the mansion and seeing how we actually functioned as a family unit. Watching Dante and Luca work together seamlessly to manage both crying babies while I took a desperately needed shower. "I still think it's crazy," she admitted, "but I can see you're happy, genuinely happy, and those babies are loved more than any children I've ever seen." She'd become Aunt Sophia to the twins, visiting regularly and providing that connection to my old life that kept me grounded when the Mafia world became overwhelming. The brothers had even relaxed security enough to let me leave the mansion occasionally with heavy guard details, and I'd started taking online classes toward the law degree I'd always dreamed of, determined to show my children that even unconventional mothers could chase their dreams. Our romantic life had evolved into something comfortable and exciting in equal measure, with both brothers respecting boundaries while still claiming their time with me possessively. Some nights belonged to Dante, filled with slow passion and deep conversations about philosophy and the future we were building. Other nights were Luca's, wild and spontaneous and full of laughter that the staff probably heard throughout the mansion. And some nights we'd all collapse together in exhausted piles after managing 2 demanding babies, falling asleep mid-conversation and waking up tangled in each other. And those nights somehow felt most right, most like the family we'd built against all odds and expectations. The twins' first Christmas was elaborate, with the mansion decorated like something from a magazine and enough presents to fill a small store, both brothers completely unable to restrain themselves when it came to spoiling their children. "They're 6 months old," I protested as another delivery truck arrived. "They don't even understand what Christmas is yet." But watching Dante's face light up as Mark grabbed at wrapping paper, and Luca's joy as Isabella laughed at the lights on the tree, I couldn't find it in me to actually object. These men who'd built empires on violence and fear were putty in their children's tiny hands, and it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever witnessed. We'd started planning the twins' first birthday party, which promised to be an event that would require security, rivaling a presidential inauguration, given the guest list of powerful and dangerous families who'd want to attend. "We could just have a small family thing," I suggested half-heartedly, knowing it was pointless. "Our children's first birthday will be remembered throughout New York," Dante declared, already making lists and plans. "It's a statement about the Moretti future and our continued dominance." Luca rolled his eyes at his brother's intensity, but was equally invested, designing invitations and planning entertainment that seemed excessive for 1-year-olds who'd probably sleep through half of it. As I sat in the mansion's garden, watching my 2 men play with our babies, passing Mark and Isabella between them, with practiced ease while discussing business deals between making silly faces, I reflected on the impossible journey that brought us here. A year ago, I'd been a waitress with no prospects, invisible to the world, and now I was wife to 2 powerful men, mother to beautiful children, and matriarch of a family that defied definition but worked perfectly for us. Yes, there were still dangers. There would always be enemies who'd see us as targets, challenges to the brothers' power that could threaten our safety, and the constant navigation of an unconventional relationship that required communication and compromise every single day. But watching Dante carefully support Mark's wobbly attempts at sitting up, while Luca made Isabella shriek with laughter by pretending to eat her toes, I knew we'd face everything together, the 3 of us united against whatever came. "What are you thinking about, Cara?" Dante called, catching me watching them with what was probably a ridiculously sappy expression. "Just that I love you," I called back. Both of you, and these perfect babies, and this crazy, impossible life we've built. Luca grinned and brought Isabella over, placing her in my arms before stealing a kiss. Best decision we ever made was claiming you that night, even if we had to share. Dante joined us with Mark, completing our circle. We don't share, brother. We multiply, and we're stronger together than we ever were apart. The future stretched before us, full of possibilities and challenges, birthday parties and business wars, school plays and territory disputes, normal parenting moments mixed with the constant reality of our dangerous world. But as Isabella grabbed my hair with surprising strength, and Mark made those serious baby sounds that suggested he was already planning world domination, I knew that whatever came, we'd face it as a family, unconventional, complicated, probably illegal in several jurisdictions, but ours and perfect in its imperfection. The Moretti dynasty had been reborn not through violence but through love, and our children would inherit not just power and wealth, but the knowledge that family came in all forms, that love didn't follow rules, and that sometimes the most impossible things created the strongest foundations. And as the sun set over the mansion, painting everything in golden light while we sat together in our garden surrounded by guards who'd become family, I whispered a silent thank you to fate for that rainy October night when everything changed, when a simple waitress caught the attention of two Mafia kings, and an impossible love story began that would echo through New York's underworld for generations to come. Thank you so much for staying with me through Emma, Dante, and Luca's incredible journey. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, subscribe for more emotional tales, and drop a comment telling me what you thought. Did you team Dante or team Luca? Or were you team both brothers like Emma? I'd love to hear from you.